Morning class. I'm going to pick up, I told you I would make a little um, screencast today and just have a couple moments worth of information to finish up about Europe on the eve of its transition toward um, greater levels of civilization or greater levels of settled existence. Europe is discussed today as one of the three sort of peripheral or periphery areas to the earliest hearths of civilization. And so we want to be careful with all this talk of civilization. We don't want to get too carried away and reach the mistaken conclusion that too much of the world was actually under the spell of these seven traits of what historians consider to be signs of civilization. So, pardon me, there's a little interruption there. So we were talking about Europe and how it is slowly moving closer to settled society and closer to what eventually, although in the case of Europe we're going to have to wait quite a while, we'll consider to be civilization. But the way in which the society broke out in Europe is quite interesting. We start to see, in the millennia prior to the emergence of civilization, even in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, some signs, agriculture and agrarian development are going to start. We know that by around 4000 BCE, 3500 BCE, there are signs that some settlements and societies are happening that have to be at least somewhat sophisticated because developments like Stonehenge, which are clearly a tremendous amount of community effort to accomplish a megalithic structure like that, which we can still see evidence of today in southern England. This is very noteworthy. But again, amidst even some of these agrarian settlements, there's still quite a bit of pure pastoral nomadism. And that's going to continue, as I mentioned in class, it's going to continue right on through the Roman Empire. But increasingly there will be societies that do settle down. They settle down in a rather interesting way. The act of settling allows for, a sedentary culture allows for the accumulation of stuff. The accumulation of stuff comes from having created some sort of agricultural surplus. And of course, if you have stuff, if you're going to go through anything of what I mentioned earlier in the course as the stuff revolution, you're going to probably start to have a society that becomes hierarchical and has certain social categories attached to it. Some people are going to administer that society and give it a sense of law and a sense of order and form. Nonetheless, in the case of many of our European settling societies, there's still going to be quite a bit of an emphasis upon warfare and violence, as I have put it down here. And that is interesting because as these societies are slowly and selectively adopting agriculture, as evident through the domestication of animals, such as in herding, particularly of cattle, which give the advantage of both meat and milk. There's going to be greater use and application of metal objects like the plow, which are important not only for turning the soil, but also for clearing the land. And that's where other tools will come in. But I mentioned to you that copper, which is sort of the earliest form of metal that the Europeans will use, has certain distinct disadvantages to it. Over time, Europeans will adopt the innovation and ability to mix tin and copper together for the alloy of bronze, which is much stronger, but even so, bronze isn't terribly strong relative to its later iron and steel counterparts. But warfare persists, and as you'll note, one of the odd things about Europe is that even as certain societies are starting to settle in, they're going to need to continue a military and warfare capability, largely for the protection of their agricultural settlements. Partly the protection of their stuff, which they're now being able to generate and produce a little bit more readily. But also they're protecting the fruits of their labors, their agriculture. And so we sort of have an interesting situation where the old traits, you would think in a pastoral nomadic society, the skills of warfare would be quite valued, and you might think that those skills might fade in terms of value as a society converts to a sedentary, more civilized existence. But in the case of Europe, there's going to be still a premium or a value placed upon one's military and martial practices for their ability to protect the settled society from outside threats. The other final comment I'll make here as we're talking about Europe is that there's also going to be an interesting role that warfare and conflict play in the sense that they bring societies together. They expose societies to different trade goods, to different cultural practices, so on and so forth. So oddly enough, on the European continent, one of the important mechanisms of transfer of culture is not just trade, but it's also warfare. And you can imagine that if a rival clan or a rival society is evolving greater military technology, it's just going to be a matter of time before your society is going to need to get with the program on that. Okay, so that's good for now. Let's now shift. I put together just a little, my best and rather brief response to Danita's comment and question today in class. And her question was a big one, and big questions are fun, and I apologize that I didn't address it right away at the beginning of class. That probably would have been the best way to go. But anyway, the question was essentially, how come as we read and we look at Europe in our readings for class today, it's a cultural backwater, it is existing on the peripheries and the margins of some of the more civilized, sophisticated, accomplished civilizations of that time, and how come today it seems like Europe has flipped that model such that Europe as a world region today is among the most advanced, and many of the places we talk about glowingly in our reading for this week, whether it's Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Indus civilizations, they seem to be comparatively behind Europe in some ways as we think of civilization. So let me just do my best to address this. And I think first off, as we get further in the course, closer toward the end, we're going to see that there are some important periods of time. We refer to these as sort of like the classical era of the ancient world, where Greek culture and Roman culture come into view. They're still several centuries off as we're moving through the course right now, but they will impart certain political and civic values that will be important to Europe. But what's interesting is that when the Roman Empire, quote unquote, falls in the late 5th century current era, Europe, the region to its north, is going to go quite dark for several centuries. So in some ways, it's as if the worst is yet to come for Europe in terms of how far it trails many other parts of the world. And for the next several centuries, it's actually going to be the Islamic world, which is soon to, after Rome falls, the Islamic world doesn't exist yet because Muhammad hasn't existed yet. But starting in the early 600s current era, there will be several centuries of Islamic civilization flourishing in the world. During much of this time, Europe goes through what we might refer to as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. In some ways that term's a little overblown. It's not like nothing is happening in Europe, but the accomplishments of Europe are quite minimal. And part of this has to do with the the feudal or medieval order that Europe practices over several centuries following the fall of Rome. Um, it has this interesting feudal land distribution where the wealthy own land, they control land, peasants serve at the leisure of the elites or aristocrats, and opportunity is almost non-existent. All opportunity in Europe tends to be traced to your family name and the circumstances of your birth. Highly immobile social order and arrangement. And that's going to be true until we get to probably like the 1300s. Actually, the first universities in Europe are datable back to the 11th century current era. So I think maybe 1096 in Bologna and Paris we start to see universities, but they're rather primitive education centers at the start, but nonetheless they're moved in a more enlightened, more informed direction. But also during the High Middle Ages, we start to see an interesting institution known as the city that emerges. And essentially the first cities form out of special charters with the king. So the king controls this vast array of lands. He has lords that he then reaches an agreement and says, Lord 1, you may have this section of land in exchange for your loyalty if I need it. In a time of unrest or uncertainty, I might call upon you and your knights to defend me on the battlefield. I will also take a portion of the the agriculture and the surplus that's produced on these lands, but we will form this agreement. And then the lords have arrangements with the lesser lords, the barons, the counts, the viscounts, you name it, this system goes on. But starting in the 1300s or so, kings also start to come up with an agreement with peasants. And for the most part, skilled peasants, peasant artisans. So think cobblers, people who make shoes. Think coopers, people who make barrels. Think fletchers, people who make arrows. Think masons, people who make bricks. These cities become little chartered experimental zones where the king is allowing essentially people who aren't from the aristocratic level of society, allowing them a chance to practice their craft and see what happens. And in these cities, under these charters, these people are given certain privileges and freedoms that are not available to the other peasants of the time. And I think this is a really important germ or seed that starts to be nurtured in Europe moving forward. If we fast forward a little bit and we look at Italy during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, Italian merchants are going to start trading with other parts of the Mediterranean. And these Italian merchants are quite profitable, and some of these more successful Italian merchants are going to be among the families that start supporting artists and intellectuals who are starting to experiment with what exactly are humans capable of. One of the messages from the Renaissance that's important is that humans are capable. They are not the flawed, fallen, worthless individuals that the Catholic Church or the Christian Church at that time portrays them as. So this belief that humans are capable also builds upon some of those earlier privileges that some Europeans have from those cities. Fast forward finally to the European Enlightenment, which now we're in the 1600s and 1700s. Building on that human capability, a number of philosophers, political philosophers, economic philosophers, start to wrap their brains around the fact that individuals, not only are they capable, but they should have certain opportunities and privileges to show that. And so the European Enlightenment gives way, aside from being written into many of the governmental documents of our day today, of our time today, they make a real powerful impression. And we can talk a little bit about the individual at some other point, maybe at the beginning of class tomorrow.